But I assure you, the selection of scriptures to go along with the movies that I selected a while back for this sermon series have been a bit serendipitous, and you'll see how the two line up today. This week's movie, Luther, that we watched actually last Sunday night, is about the early church father, Martin Luther. Now, for those who may still not know who that is, Martin Luther is most famous for nailing a set of complaints he had about his Catholic contemporaries and their practices, and nailing those complaints to the door of a church. Now, rather than being arrested for vandalism, he was instead summoned to Rome to account for these 95 theses, to protect himself against charges of heresy. Now, by the time he had gone to Rome, his 95 Theses had been reprinted and spread throughout all of Europe, but so that you can see why Rome would want him summoned, and summoned quickly. Luther's theses were complaints he had about the unbiblical and, in his opinion, and they were really, inhuman practices the church had been perverted to represent. Now, this movie, rather than focusing merely on the plot of Luther versus the Catholic Church, which is, when you study Luther, that's sort of the dichotomy that you get. That's what you study, Luther versus the Catholic Church. It also portrays a very important part of who Martin Luther was. His love and care for the poor and the marginalized. He warns peasants not to pay for indulgences, and we'll get to indulgences in a little bit, but rather to use the money they would use on paying for indulgences to care for themselves and their loved ones. A young boy had committed suicide, had hung himself, and the law stated that those who committed suicide were not able to be buried in a church graveyard. Martin Luther thought that to be such an outrage that he risked his neck and his ministry to dig the grave for the boy himself within the church graveyard. Rather than seeing the poor and indigent as the sole authors of their own plight, he saw them as fellow creatures of sacred worth who needed to see the grace of God in flesh and blood. Conversely, or not, depending on how you view it, our scripture passage today is the 8th chapter of the prophecy of the minor prophet Amos. Israel had been treating their poor very poorly. Amos prophesies against their careless and heartless nature and lays out God's reaction to the same. Taking the sun out of the sky, turning feasts into funeral marches, making each trial as difficult as the loss of a child. Amos means to ensure no one mistakes how seriously God believes their trespasses to have been. Now, this passage from Amos is, again, part of the lectionary. For those who may not know, the lectionary is a 3-year plan that someone has spread Scripture out over 3 years so that through the course of the year, churches who decide to follow it can get through the Bible, through most of it, in due course, in that 3 years. However, it appears as if these two things, the lectionary and this movie, or the ideas presented by our lectionary reading in the movie, were destined to meet up in our minds. As I said, I chose the movies way back before I chose the scripture. Both deal with the plight of the poor to varying degrees. And to sort of introduce us into thinking about this, I found a Turkish fable that talks about one poor man. This man was walking down the street in a village in medieval Turkey. He had only a piece of bread in his hands. He came to a restaurant where he saw some meatballs were being grilled. The cooking meat was so near and smelled so delicious to him that the man held his piece of bread over the meatballs to catch a bit of the scent. Now, as he started to eat the bread, the angry restaurant owner seized him and took him away to see a judge named Hoja. This man was stealing the smell of my meat without asking permission, said the restaurant owner. I want you to make him pay me for it. Hoja took a minute to think, and held his purse in front of the owner and shook it. "What are you doing that for?" asked the owner. Hoja replied, "I am paying you. The sound of money is fair payment for the smell of food." The issue of how we treat the poor and the other least of these among us is supremely important to our identity as Christians. Probably, and I may be willing to go as far as definitely more important than many other things we have held on to as important. Now, Martin Luther was not the only person to be understood as important to the Reformation, or the reason that we don't currently worship in a Catholic church. However, he does provide the starkest examples of why it is we're not all Roman Catholic. In the movie, Martin is sent to Rome to deliver a message to someone. He was sent by his spiritual father in the movie, who is an important character throughout his life in providing spiritual and moral support through his trials. And he thought it might do Martin some good to see the Holy City. Now, while he was there, Martin had decided to buy an indulgence for his grandmother. Essentially, a living person could buy an indulgence for one who was dead, and this would somehow lessen the time this person spent in purgatory. Martin would become disillusioned by this process. Now, upon arriving in Rome, he saw people selling trinkets associated with particular saints for particular reasons. This, you see him visibly sort of taken aback by how icky he believes that to be. There were women with empty stares guiding men, sometimes clergy, to quiet and secluded places. And the line to purchase an indulgence ended at a table where a gruff man pounded the top of a wooden box, indicating where you should put your money before you were to receive your indulgence certificate, guaranteeing that your loved one would spend less time in purgatory. And that wasn't all. For your indulgence to be complete, one was instructed to climb the steps of the cathedral on one's knees, stopping on each step to pray the rosary. Dozens of stone steps with no knee pads. You do the math on how your knees are going to feel after that. Martin noticed some things. Most of the people climbing these steps